This week on Brian Ross Investigates, an investigative reporter takes on Georgia's new election law.
Right after this law was passed, there was a revival of a challenge to the votes of 364,000 Georgia voters.
Asking how this one local Republican Party official was able to personally challenge the eligibility of some 32,000 voters.
And you have crossed the line. You have crossed the line. Get out of my house now.
I shall get out of your house
before
now.
I throw you.
And you are sure that this is your legal voting address?
Plus, what's in store for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin being sentenced to prison this week? We'll hear from a current inmate.
Geez, I hate to say this, but I would say that you're probably going to try to kill him.
And we'll talk with a former warden.
So this is going to be a very hard time for Derek Chauvin.
It really is. It's going to be a hard time.
And this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite.
Some of your campaign supporters suggesting somehow that by doing this, it works to suppress the vote. I'm not sure I understand how that works.
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our viewers on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined as always by my colleague at Law&Crime, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with a new investigative report out of Georgia and what might be called the Great Purge. The Georgia Secretary of State says his office is going to remove some 100,000 people from the voter registration lists. People, he says, have not been active, have not voted in some time. But there's yet another purge being demanded, this one by Republican Party officials in Georgia, who say they are now challenging the eligibility of some 360,000 voters, something they say they can legally do under Georgia's new voting laws. Rhonda?
That's right, Brian. And now comes investigative reporter Greg Palast with backing from the progressive Tom Hartman report with a new investigation looking into who's behind all this and how they're using a new provision in Georgia's new state voting law to challenge so many voters, claiming they've changed addresses, they moved out of state, all without, it seems, any personal knowledge or investigation into the underlying facts, Brian.
To learn more about this, we're joined now by investigative reporter Greg Palast with the Palast Investigative Fund. Greg, tell us about this new provision in the Georgia voting rights law.
The new Georgia law says that any citizen of Georgia can challenge another voter, an unlimited number of voters.
The precise language from the law: there shall not be a limit on the number of persons whose qualifications such elector may challenge.
And right after this law was passed, there was a revival of a challenge to the votes of 364,000 Georgia voters.
And who made these challenges?
Well, there were 88 operatives of a group called True the Vote. Now, almost all of them were Republican officials of one type or another. We had in 88 counties, we had one official who personally challenged 32,000 voters.
That was this woman, Pamela Reardon, a Cobb County Republican Party official who told Palast how she got the 32,000 voters' names to challenge from a conservative group called True the Vote, which researches change of address data nationwide.
They're out of Texas, and they work on this constantly, and they've been doing it for over 10 years.
So True the Vote gave you the list, or?
They had been working on the list with a couple other organizations to vet it, and then the other challenge is the list I got from the guy that's been working through it to get every single one of them vetted.
I see, cool.
So we're working on that.
She claims that she knows for a fact that these are voters ineligible to vote.
But when Palast showed her photos of the 32,000 voters she challenged...
Do you know this woman? Do you recognize that woman?
Not offhand. I don't...
You never spoke to her?
No.
What about this guy and his wife on his honeymoon? Do you recognize that man?
No.
And in fact, did not know any of the voters she challenged, whether they were eligible or not.
Did you ever speak to Storm Saul?
No, I told you already. I did not speak to the 32,000 people.
Yet she had certified she knew as a fact they were not legal voters.
That's correct. She never called anyone. She never wrote anyone. She never did any, personal investigation, and neither did any of the other 88. who challenged 1/3 voters. Just no attempt to do this correctly at all.
If the counties accept the challenges, officials are required to send postcards to notify all those voters their eligibility has been challenged.
I did not try to stop them from voting.
You challenged, excuse me.
That is, you are, no, you're making up a story here. You are making a story which is wrong. Okay, the challenge is you take it in there and say, according to the national change of address, these people have changed their address. So check it out.
Well, this is
so I didn't challenge them per se.
And she was not happy with the outcome of the interview.
No, she wasn't.
No, I'm done, because you are not listening to me, and you are putting words in my mouth, which is not even, no, you, sir, get out of my house.
Okay, I will get out of your house. I just want to know.
And you are not listening to me.
Okay, do you know that you could go to prison? Do you understand that under the Ku Klux Klan law of 1871?
Get out. And you have crossed the line. You have crossed the line. Get out of my house now.
I shall get out of your house
before
now.
I throw you.
And you are sure that this is your legal voting address?
You are an
So what about these voters? Do they know they've been challenged, and how do they sort of make sure they can vote legally?
Well, two things. The ones we spoke to said they were shocked and stunned because they never got any contact from Ms. Reardon or from the True the Vote or anyone. Now, Reardon says that she wanted the county to send out postcards to all these people. And now here, according to the ACLU, which is opposing, which was shocked when they heard that they're reviving this attempt to challenge these voters. They said, look, the lawyer for the ACLU told us that you have to have some care, some personal knowledge. You can't just willy-nilly remove voters from the voter rolls. Now, here's what they have to do if you want to get back on. You must go to your county clerk's office. You have to see that you got a card. You have to go to the county clerk's office and prove you are who you are and live where you live. There's a day of work, and most people, very few people will respond to that card. In fact, the ACLU was worried that people would, because you'd have thousands of people jamming into these clerk's offices if this goes ahead during a pandemic in these small offices. Not a good idea.
So as it stands now, for those more than 300,000 voters, they're off the rolls, or they have to prove they are eligible?
Well, that's what we'll see, because right now, the county is supposed to be sending out those postcards, and each of those voters is going to have to come in and verify who they are, or the next time they cast a ballot, it'll be thrown in the garbage. It won't count.
All right, Greg Palast, investigative reporter at Palast Foundation, thank you so much for being here tonight.
You're very welcome, Brian, and there'll be a further report in The Guardian where I've been covering elections. Thank you.
We reached out to that Republican woman, Pamela Reardon, for a comment. And Rhonda, how did that go?
Well, Brian, in a phone call that lasted about a minute, Pamela Reardon told me everything she did was legal. Anyone can do it. It's all based on public post office change of address records. She told me she threw Greg Palast out of her house because he clearly did not know the law and had obtained the interview under false pretenses. Palast says his team asked her for an interview about her political candidacy and never promised to ask only puff questions, and they left when asked.
All right. Well, coming up next on Brian Ross Investigates, with the sentencing of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin set for this Friday, we'll talk with a current inmate and a former warden about what Chauvin faces behind bars. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law&Crime Trial Network. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is set to be sentenced to prison this Friday, and prosecutors are asking for a kind of throw the book at him kind of sentence, Rhonda.
That's right, Brian. While Minnesota's state guidelines would normally mean a sentence range of 10 to 15 years, prosecutors have asked for a sentence of 30 years for Derek Chauvin, citing aggravating circumstances, including particular egregious cruelty of the crime and carrying it out in front of children, Brian.
We're joined now by Michael J. Moore, who's an inmate in a prison in Washington State, also a freelance writer. Michael, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tell me, from your point of view, what's it going to be like for an officer like Derek Chauvin to serve time behind bars? What happens to police once they're in prison?
I have to say that his experience would be terrible. He would be an instant target.
How so?
So the maximum security prisons are obviously on the inmate front are ran by gang. They're going to send somebody after him automatically. They're going to send somebody to stab him or a couple people to beat him up. So for Derek Chauvin, it's going to be clearly it's going to be worse. He's going to go in, people are going to recognize him instantly, and I would, I hate to say this, but I would say that they're probably going to try to kill him.
Really? Because he's an officer, a former police officer?
Not just because he's a former police officer, but because his case is so high profile. So what happens is the guys in here, they earn a lot of points, I guess you would say, with whatever their affiliation is, for things like that. So they're going to see a guy like Chauvin, and they're not just going to want to hurt him. They're going to want to really hurt him. They'll probably try to kill him.
And are there gangs that would support a police officer behind bars?
Absolutely not. No, that's not a thing in any prison that I've ever heard of.
So from your point of view, Derek Chauvin faces some tough time behind bars, really tough.
Yeah, he's going to have a very negative experience, and it's probably something that shouldn't happen. Once they put him in prison, he's already serving his sentence, right?
And what advice would you give to Derek Chauvin as he prepares to go to prison? What is there any advice that would keep him safe, do you think?
You know, I hate to say it, it's a bleak reality for a guy like him, but there's really nothing he can do except as soon as he gets to prison, he needs to explain to the first person that he sees that works within the prison administration that he needs to be in protective custody. They're going to know that already. That's really all there is for a guy like him.
Michael Moore, I want to thank you so much for joining us and for your insights from behind the bars.
Yeah, Brian, thank you for having me. Anytime.
To get more on this, we're now joined by a former warden, Cameron Lindsay, who served in the federal system across the country and also in a number of private prisons. Mr. Lindsay, thank you so much for being here. Let's begin by having your description of what happens to police officers when they end up behind bars.
Well, Brian, thank you for having me. Police officers have to be treated very carefully when they come into the system for safety and security purposes. One could argue that Derek Chauvin is America's most hated person. So therefore, the Minnesota Department of Corrections will have a challenge in terms of ensuring his safety and security.
And do you think there'll be inmates who will be out to get him?
I don't think there's any question about it. He is just too big of a target.
And so nuts and bolts, what does a warden do in that situation?
Nuts and bolts, Brian, I believe that unequivocally, they're going to have to place him in some type of protective custody staff. He will be in some type of isolation, solitary confinement, if you will, where he will expect to be locked down probably 23 hours a day with 1 hour a day devoted to recreation. But they being the Minnesota DOC does have a responsibility to safeguard him. And I think the only way to do that is to keep him single-celled throughout the duration of his incarceration.
And do you also have to keep an eye as a warden on a possible suicide?
Absolutely, you do. The DOC should have mental health professionals checking on this individual as they would on all inmates. And everybody realizes the sensitive nature of this case. There are many people who would like to see Derek Chauvin dead, but that, in my mind, is irrelevant. We have a constitutional obligation to ensure that our systems of justice are upheld, and that means ensuring the safety and security of every inmate that is incarcerated.
So this is going to be a very hard time for Derek Chauvin.
It really is. It's going to be a hard time. And the thing about solitary confinement is I used to be a believer in it and used it at times, but I do not believe in it any longer for any kind of long-term purposes. Unquestionably, it causes mental illness, and those who already have mental illnesses, it exacerbates those mental illnesses. So I am not a proponent of solitary confinement, especially in the long term. So it's going to take some creativity in terms of how Mr. Chauvin should be managed while doing his time.
All right. Cameron Lindsay, thank you so much for being with us tonight and for your insights. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Brian.
And we'll have full coverage on Friday of the sentencing of Derek Chauvin. Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who is the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law and Crime Trial Network, is part of the Dan Abrams media empire. And Aidan, let's begin with the winner you've chosen, John Berman at CNN, for his interview with New York mayor candidate Eric Adams.
So your specific problem was the date they decided to campaign together. If they had campaigned together yesterday on June 20th, you would have been okay with it?
I would have looked at it something differently. I think it sent the wrong signal and the wrong message, and that is how many of the African-American Hispanic candidates felt after they saw it.
Some of your campaign supporters suggesting somehow that by doing this, it works to suppress the vote. I'm not sure I understand how that works.
Well, I can't speak on behalf of my supporters, but I do know this.
But you disagree then that it suppresses the vote?
No.
So tough questions from John Berman there for Mr. Adams, sort of playing the race card, I guess, Aidan?
That's right. So it's obviously election day in New York today, and that man that you just saw is very likely to be the next mayor. He faced a tough interview from John Berman on New Day, which is CNN's morning show, yesterday on Monday. The genesis of the clip is our comments that Eric Adams made on the subject of two of his rivals, Andrew Yang and Catherine Garcia, who have chosen to campaign together. Adams attacks that alliance by accusing those two candidates of seeking to stop a person of color from gaining higher office. That comment from Adams has been seen as sort of an odd and self-serving invocation of racism in order to make a political attack on his opponents, not to mention that Andrew Yang, as he pointed out in response, is a person of color himself. So John Berman did a good job questioning Adams about that comment on CNN on Monday. And Adams, I think, failed to provide an adequate response of why he was casting the effort by his two rivals to team up and campaign together as racist.
All right. And for loser, once again, you've chosen Tucker Carlson at Fox, beginning with his theory that somehow the FBI was behind the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol.
The government knows who they are, but the government has not charged them. Why is that? You know why. They were almost certainly working for the FBI. So FBI operatives were organizing the attack on the Capitol on January 6th.
So, Aidan, what do you say about that?
Now, I know that Tucker Carlson is very often the subject of our loser of the day. This segment that he put out has prompted, once again, 1 million fact checks and outraged columns, his latest controversial comments. This time it was claiming without any evidence at all that the FBI orchestrated the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Tucker Carlson has made efforts to downplay the attack before and deflect blame from Trump, who is primarily responsible for the horde of his supporters that ransacked the Capitol building. But this time he made what legal experts have described as an embarrassing misreading of court documents to claim that the FBI has been proven to have orchestrated this attack on January 6th. Now, while that controversy is fading, Ben Smith at the New York Times dropped a great piece on Sunday night that reported that Carlson, who attacks journalists regularly on his show, is actually a secret source for many of them. It was a pretty revealing look behind the curtain and certainly demonstrated some hypocrisy on behalf of the Fox News host.
And what does that say about Tucker Carlson, that on one hand, passing on these theories, wild as they might be, and then on the other hand, quietly giving background information to reporters of the so-called mainstream media about both Fox News and about Donald Trump.
I think it's a worthy reminder that Tucker Carlson has always been in media. He is part of the media elite. So the sort of populist character that he plays on his show, while he believes in a lot of those policies and beliefs, you have to remember that he, has worked in magazines since the 1990s and is very much a cable news host. So I think that's worth remembering. He talks to journalists still.
And there was another piece of news reportedly that he has decided not to run for president, as if that was a possibility.
Yeah, there's a speculation about him running for president has gone on for a couple of years now, since his Fox News show blew up. I asked him about it in an interview last year, and he laughed off the proposition. He's always denied that he has any plans to run for president. I think it's safe to say with anyone running for president, you don't really know what they want to do until it comes to campaign season.
And bottom line, all this controversy, being chosen the loser again and again, I guess it's good for his ratings?
I do think to a certain extent he revels in the fact that not only is he the top rated host on cable news, but also that he dominates the conversation on Twitter. I think one of the only reasons that you can explain why night after night he chooses to provoke and cover such provocative subjects in ways that often sparks controversy is that he really likes seeing his name in the New York Times. I think that's as good an explanation for why he covers some of the things that he does as any. So I think it helps with the ratings, and it also helps keep him in conversation.
Great. All right, Aidan, thank you so much. And thank you all for watching tonight. And thanks to our great staff.